First Lady Barbara Bush advocates it and writes articles in newspapers and the Reader's Digest. Jim Trelease has written the handbook about it. Newsweek, in their special education issue, gives a seven-step program on how to do it. What is it? It's reading aloud in the home. Parents sharing books with their children from a very young age. Not just parents, but grandparents, aunts and uncles, big brothers and sisters, and babysitters too. For this program, which is having its first showing during Education Week, I thought we would look at some old favorites. Here is how some parents who are members of the Natick school system get to know unforgettable book characters with their children. First, we have a girl, a very small French girl with a scarred childhood. She is Madeline, created in 1938 by Ludwig Bemelmans. Brown School counselor Kathy Marmarick and her 6-year-old daughter Emily, a first grader in Newton, are the readers.
In an old house in Paris that was covered with vines
lived 12 little girls in 2 straight lines.
In 2 straight lines they broke their bread
and brushed their teeth
and went to bed.
Look at them. They smiled at the good
and frowned at the bad.
And sometimes they were very sad. Oh, look at what happened.
They left the house at 9:30 in 2 straight lines.
In rain
or shine.
The smallest one was Madeline.
She was not afraid of mice.
Oh, look at her go after them. Do you see that? She loved winter, snow, and ice.
To the tiger in the zoo, Madeline just said poo-poo.
And nobody knew so well how to frighten Miss Clavel.
In the middle of the night, Miss Clavel turned on her light and said something is not right.
Little Madeline sat in bed, cried and cried. Her eyes were red.
And soon after Dr. Cohen came, he rushed out to the phone.
And he dialed, thank you, Danton 10-6. Nurse, he said, it's an appendix.
Everybody had to cry, not a single eye was dry. Madeline was in his arms, in a blanket safe and warm.
In a car with a red light, they drove out into the night.
Madeline woke up 2 hours later in a room with flowers.
Madeline soon ate and drank. On her bed, there was a crank. Do you know what that's for? What do you think that's for?
To make the bed sit up.
I think you're right. I said, except now they have buttons, don't they? Yeah, okay.
And the crack on the ceiling had the habit of sometimes looking like a rabbit.
That's a silly looking crack. Outside were birds, trees, and sky, and so 10 days passed quickly by.
One nice morning, Miss Clavel said, "Isn't this a fine
day to visit
Madeline?"
And what were the girls going to get for her?
Flowers.
Yes. Visitors from 2 to 4 read a sign outside her door.
Tiptoeing with solemn face, with some flowers and a vase.
In they walked and then said, ah, when they saw the toys and candy and the dollhouse from Papa.
But the biggest surprise so far was on her stomach. There was a scar.
Oh my goodness, this doll even has a scar too. That's right, just like, that's the real thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Goodbye, they said, we'll come again.
And the little girls left in the rain.
They went home and broke their bread, brushed their teeth,
and went to bed.
In the middle of one night, Miss Clavel turned on the light and said, something is not right. You can just leave that, okay. And afraid of a disaster, Miss Clavel ran fast.
No, that's mine.
Okay, that's right. Go ahead.
Miss Clavel ran fast.
and faster. And she said, "Please, children, do tell me what is troubling you."
And all the little girls cried, "Boo-hoo, we want to have our appendix out too."
They want to have, why do they want their appendix out too?
Because then they'd be so lucky. They'd get to have all the toys and stuff.
Oh, I think so. Do you think so? "Good night, little girls. Thank the Lord you are well. Now go to sleep," said Miss Clavel.
And she turned out the light and closed the door, and that's all there is. There isn't any more.
Oh, what a story. Did you like that? Yeah, that's a nice one. And I like that pop-up book. Yeah. What do you think? Hmm?
Thank you, Kathy and Emily. That's not the only adventure that Madeline has. There's also Madeline and the Gypsies, Madeline and the Bad Hat, Madeline in London, and Madeline's Rescue. And I hope many of you will enjoy the further adventures of this wild French girl. Now, for another book, which has also been around since 1938. Mr. Popper was a house painter in the town of Stillwater. From spring to fall, he painted houses to support his family of Mrs. Popper and his children, Janie and Bill. Mr. Popper was a man with money problems and big dreams. During the winter months, he read books about all the faraway places he had never seen. His favorite exotic continent was Antarctica. He wrote a letter to Admiral Drake, the famous explorer, telling him how much he loved penguins. Imagine Mr. Popper's surprise when he received a present from Admiral Drake, a penguin of his very own. He named the penguin Captain Cook. At first, Captain Cook made a big hit in Stillwater. Mr. Popper took him for walks everywhere, but soon Mrs. Popper began to complain of the expense of having a penguin living in the household. Penguins need the cold ice of Antarctica. So the Poppers let Captain Cook live in their refrigerator. Mrs. Popper just had to find another place for her food. Soon even refrigerator ice cubes didn't make their penguin happy. Captain Cook seemed so sad he was going to die. Mr. Popper wrote a desperate letter to the curator of a large aquarium. Surprise! The cure for Mr. Popper's penguin was another penguin, a female the Poppers named Greta. Now the birds no longer lived in the refrigerator, but in the downstairs of the Popper's house. With all the windows open, the winter snows drifted in until the living room looked just like the South Pole. Janie and Bill had fun playing in the snow with the penguins. Now for Chapter 12 from Mr. Popper's Penguins by Richard and Florence Atwater, with pictures by Robert Larson. The reader is Mary Beth Undersea Klotz, a Natick School graduate and a volunteer at the Bennett Hemingway Library, and she is reading to her sons Jonathan, who is 6 and a first grader, and Brian, who is 4.
More mouths to feed. So the next day, Mr. Popper called an engineer and had a large freezing plant installed in the cellar and took Captain Cook and Greta down there to live. Then he had the furnace taken out and moved upstairs into the living room. It looked very odd there, but as Mrs. Popper said, it was a relief at least to not have to wear their overcoats all the time. Mr. Popper was quite worried when he found that all these changes were going to be very expensive. The refrigerating engineer was worried too when he found that Mr. Popper had practically no money. However, Mr. Popper promised to pay as soon as he could, and the man let him have everything on credit. It was a good thing that Mr. Popper got the penguins moved when he did, because Mrs. Popper had been right about the eggs. The rookery had scarcely been moved to the basement when Greta laid the first egg. 3 days later, the second one appeared. Since Mr. Popper knew that penguins lay only 2 eggs a season, he was astonished when a little later the third egg was found under Greta. Whether the change in climate had changed the penguins' breeding habits, Mr. Popper never knew, but every third day a new one would appear until there were 10 in all. Now penguin eggs are so large that the mother can sit only on 2 at a time, and this created quite a problem. Mr. Popper solved it, however, by distributing the extra eggs under hot water bottles and electric heating pads kept just at penguin body heat. Can you imagine those big eggs?
Yes.
The penguin chicks, when they began to hatch, were not so handsomely marked as their mother and father. They were fuzzy, droll little creatures who grew at a tremendous rate. Captain Cook and Greta were kept very busy bringing food to them, though. Of course, the Poppers all helped, too. Mr. Popper, who had always been such a great reader, had no difficulty in thinking of names for the penguin children. They were Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. Still, he was rather relieved that there were no more than 10 to name. Right?
Right.
Yeah. Mrs. Popper, too, thought that this was about enough penguins for anybody, though they really did not make much difference to her in her housework. As long as Mr. Popper and the children remembered to close the cellar door in the kitchen. Can you imagine all those penguins, huh? Yeah?
Well, where are the penguins?
Well, there's Captain Cook and Greta, and one of the, what you have to do is, there aren't that many pictures in here, you have to imagine the penguins.
Yeah.
Right? I'll show you another picture that has them.
Which one's that?
Hmm?
Which one's that?
Well, this one could be any of them, don't you think? They must have all looked alike at the beginning. The penguins all loved to climb the stairs that led up to the kitchen and never knew when to stop unless they found the kitchen door closed. Then, of course, they would turn around and toboggan down the steps again. This made rather a curious noise sometimes when Mrs. Popper was working in the kitchen, but she got used to it as she had got used to so many other strange things this winter. The freezing plant that Mr. Popper had got for the penguins downstairs was a large and good one. It made very large blocks of ice. You're being silly. Instead of small ice cubes, so that Mr. Popper had made a sort of ice castle down there for the 12 penguins to live in and climb over.
Yeah, but what did giant ice cubes come out of?
Yeah, like a large, there's like a freezing plant down there. Like a large refrigerator. Can you imagine? Mr. Popper also dug a large hole in the cellar floor and made a swimming and diving pool for the birds. From time to time, he would throw live fish into the pool for the penguins to dive for. They found this very refreshing because, to tell the truth, they had got a little tired of canned shrimps. The live fish were specially ordered and were brought all the way from the coast in tank cars and glass boxes to 432 Proudfoot Avenue. Unfortunately, they were quite expensive.
Keep on reading. I give them away to Libby.
You can help me here.
Okay.
It
was nice that there were so many penguins because when two of them, usually Nelson and Columbus, got into a fight, they began to spear at each other, spar at each other with their flippers. The 10 other penguins would all crowd around to witness this fight and make encouraging remarks. This made a very interesting little scene.
Mr. Popper also flooded a part of the cellar floor for an ice rink, and here the penguins often drilled like a sort of small army in fantastic marching movements and parades around the ice. The penguin Louisa seemed especially fond of leading these marching drills. It was quite a sight to see them, after Mr. Popper had the idea of training Louisa to hold a small American flag in her beak while she proudly led the solemn parades. Janie and Bill would often bring their little friends home from school with them, and they would all go down and watch the penguins for hours. At night, instead of sitting and reading and smoking his pipe in the living room, as he had done before, Mr. Popper would put on his overcoat and take his things downstairs. There he would sit and read with his mittens on, looking up from time to see what his pets were doing. He often thought about the cold, distant regions in which the little creatures really belonged. Often, too, he thought how different his life had been before the penguins had come to keep him occupied. It was January now, and already he had dreaded to think of the time when spring would come and he would have to leave them all day and go back to painting houses.
Thank you, Mary Beth, Jonathan, and Brian. To find out what happens when Mr. Popper and his penguins take their show on the road, read the rest of the book. And now for a brand new old favorite. Judy Blume is one of the most popular and controversial authors of books for children, but there's no doubt that her 1972 book, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, is a favorite read-aloud for families all across the country. Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing is told by Peter Hatcher, average 9-year-old who has family problems. His father is an advertising executive who makes commercials. His mother is a normal person, but his 2-year-old brother, Farley Dexter Hatcher, called Fudge, is a real terror. Much of Peter's energy is directed towards keeping Fudge out of his bedroom, and especially away from his pet turtle named Dribble. One of Mr. Hatcher's advertising accounts is for Juicy-O. The Juicy-O executive and his wife foolishly decide to stay with the Hatchers when they visit New York City. Fudge makes their stay somewhat less than relaxing. When he sticks green stamps all over their luggage, it's the last straw. Mr. and Mrs. Juicy-O decide it's time to check into a hotel. Fudge goes through a phase where he won't eat anything. Mrs. Hatcher discovers that Fudge will only eat when Peter stands on his head. Peter soon gets tired of this game. Sometimes Fudge likes to pretend he's a dog and will only eat when his food is put in a doggy bowl on the floor. One dinner, Fudge refuses to eat anything. Mr. Hatcher is really fed up. Fudge, you will eat your dinner or wear it. He takes Fudge to the bathroom, puts him in the tub, and dumps cornflakes on his head. At the next meal, Fudge's eating problems miraculously disappear. Peter's best friend is Jimmy Fargo, who lives in his apartment building. Also living in the same building is a girl named Sheila Tubman. Peter's got the coaties, Peter's got the coaties, was all that Sheila yelled during 2nd grade. Now that Sheila is a mature 4th grader, she convinces Mrs. Hatcher that she would be a terrific babysitter for Fudge. She takes him to Central Park to play. Fudge has climbed to the top of the jungle gym, and he suddenly decides to be a bird and try flying. He smashes to the ground, knocking out his 2 front teeth. Fudge now looks like a very small 1st grader, and Peter secretly thinks of his brother as Fang. Fudge finds Peter's room a forbidden temptation. First, he scribbles on the poster called Transportation in the City that Sheila, Jimmy, and Peter had made for school. Then he sneaks in and cuts off his hair and writes with magic marker all over his face. But when he comes in and eats the turtle Dribble, it is really the last straw. The x-ray at the hospital shows that Fudge really did eat the turtle. At last, the doctors tell Mrs. Hatcher that the medicine, all that castor oil and milk of magnesia and prune juice finally worked. The turtle is out. And Peter is given a new pet, a large, friendly dog. Peter names him Turtle. In 1980, Judy Blume wrote a sequel, Super Fudge. The Hatcher family has gotten larger. There is now a baby sister named Tamara Roxanne, but everyone calls her Tootsie. Peter says, I have a brother called Fudge, and now I have a sister called Tootsie. Maybe what my parents really wanted was a candy factory. The Hatchers have moved to Princeton, New Jersey. Fudge, a precocious 4-year-old, goes to kindergarten in the same school where Peter is in the 6th grade. Fudge hates his teacher, whom he calls Ratface. He has moved to another room and a nicer teacher named Ms. Ziff. Fudge now has a pet of his very own, a minor bird named Uncle Feather. Uncle Feather can talk and knows many dirty words, which he screams out at all the wrong times. One of the most catastrophic events that happened at school that year was the day the children's author Brian Tumpkin came to the assembly and invited Fudge, up on the stage to describe a person for him to draw. He's tall, he's got a fat belly that hangs over his pants, and he's mostly bald, but he's got some hair around the edges, and he wears glasses, and he's got a pointy nose and a mustache that curls down around his mouth, and he's got crooked front teeth, and his feet are very long, and he walks like a duck. Fudge was describing, and Brian Tumpkin was drawing none other than the principal, Mr. Green. Now, Judy Blume has written a third book about Fudge and Peter and the rest of the Hatchers. It is Fudge-a-mania. Kathy Catanay, a 7th grade English teacher at Wilson Middle School, reads to her children, Caitlin, Michael, and Lauren.
Who's the lucky bride? Guess what, Pete, my brother Fudge said. I'm getting married tomorrow. I looked up from my baseball cards. Isn't this kind of sudden, I asked, since Fudge is only 5. No, he said. Well, who's the lucky bride? Sheila Tubman, Fudge said. I hit the floor, pretending to have fainted dead away. I did a good job of it because Fudge started shaking me and shouting, "Get up, Pete!" What's with this Pete business, I thought. Ever since he could talk, he's called me Peter. Then Tootsie, my sister, who's just a year and a half, danced around me singing, "Up, Pete, up!" Next, Mom was beside me saying, "Pete, what happened? Are you all right?" I told him I was getting married, Fudge said, and he just fell over. I fell over when you told me who you were marrying, I said. Who are you marrying, Fudge? Mom asked, as if we were seriously discussing this wedding. Sheila Tubman, said Fudge. Don't say that name around me, I told him, or I'll faint again. Speaking of Sheila Tubman, Mom began, but I didn't wait for her to finish. You're making me feel very sick, I warned. Really, Pete, Mom said? Aren't you overdoing it? I clutched my stomach and moaned, but Mom went right on talking. Buzz Tubman is the one who told us about the house in Maine. M-A-I-N-E spells Maine, Fudge sang. Mom looked at him but didn't even pause. And this house is right next to the place they've rented for their vacation, she told me. I'm missing something here, I said. What house? What vacation? Remember we decided to go away for a few weeks in August? Yeah. So? So we got a great deal on a house in Maine. And the Tubmans are going to be next door? I couldn't believe this. Sheila Tubman next door for 2 whole weeks? 3, said Mom. I fell flat on the floor again. He did it again, Mom, Fudge said. He's just pretending, Mom told Fudge, and he's being very silly. So I don't have to marry Sheila tomorrow, Fudge said. I'll marry her in Maine. That makes more sense, Mom said. In Maine, you can have a nice wedding under the trees. Under the trees, Fudge said. Geez, Tootsie said, throwing a handful of gummy bears in my face. And that's how it all began. That night, we went to Tico Taco for supper. I wasn't very hungry. The idea of spending 3 weeks next to Sheila Tubman was enough to take away my appetite. I wish the Tubmans would move to another planet. But until that happens, there's no way to avoid Sheila. She lives in our apartment building. We go to the same school. I kind of groaned, and Dad looked at me. What is it, Peter? Sheila Tubman, I said. What about her, Dad asked. We're getting married, Fudge said, his mouth full of chicken and taco salad. I'm not talking about your wedding, I said. I'm talking about spending 3 weeks in Maine next door to the Tubmans. Oh, it won't be as bad as you think, Mom said. You don't know how bad I think it'll be. Sheila's older now. She's finished 6th grade, same as you. What's age got to do with it, I said. She'll still be queen of cooties. What's cooties, asked Fudge. When I didn't answer, he tugged on my sleeve. What's cooties, Pete? Since when am I Pete, I asked, shaking him off. Since today, he said. Well, I prefer Peter, if you don't mind. Pete is a better name for a big brother. And Farley is a better name for a little brother. I figured that would shut him up, since his real name is Farley Dexter Hatcher, and he's ready to kill anybody who calls him that. Don't call me Farley, he said, And then he really let go and yelled, "I'm Fudge!" The waiter, who heard him from across the room, came over to our table and said, "Sorry, but we don't have any tonight. But we do have a mud pie, which is almost the same thing." Dad had to explain that we weren't talking about dessert. And Mom added, "We never eat dessert until we've finished our main course." "Oh," said the waiter. But before he had a chance to get away, Fudge looked up at him and said, "Do you have cooties?" "Cooties?" the waiter asked. "For dessert?" He looked confused, especially when Tootsie banged her spoon against the tray of her baby seat and sang, "Cootie, cootie." I could tell Fudge was about to ask the same question again, but before he had the chance, I clamped my hand over his mouth. Then Dad told the waiter we didn't need anything else right now. The waiter walked away shaking his head, and I took my hand away from Fudge's mouth. As soon as I did, he was back in business. "What's cooties?" This time, the people at the next table looked over at us. "They're like nits," Mom told him quietly. "What's nits?" Fudge asked. "Head lice," said Dad, almost in a whisper. "Head mice?" Fudge said. "Not mice, turkey brain," I told him. "Lice. Little creepy crawly bugs that live in hair." I snapped my fingernails at his head the way Sheila Tubman used to do to me. Fudge yelled, "I don't want creepy crawly bugs in my hair." Well, now everyone in the restaurant looked over at us. "That's enough, Peter," Dad said. "Well, he's the one that wanted to know." "That's enough," Mother said. It came out sounding like enough, which got Tootsie going. "Eee!" Tootsie shrieked, banging her spoon. This is the way it's going to be all summer, I thought, only worse.
That was the beginning of the Hatchers' unforgettable vacation. And all of you at home, try reading these books aloud. I guarantee you'll all have a wonderful time.